song lyrics say, get on your knees for the king of sleaze. Let me tell you about the king of sleaze. King of sleaze has been sitting over 15 years, so the first thing I do with a bike that's been sitting this long is change the battery. I don't even test it or try and charge it. I know it's going to be no good, so I'm going to change the battery. Okay, here's a quick little battery trick I want to show you. Battery terminal screw usually has a nut that slides in the terminal. When you tighten the screw, it'll pick up that nut, but a lot of times when you have your connectors on there, it's thicker and it doesn't allow the screw to bend down there and pick up that nut. You see that nut is able to float. And if you take your screw out and tilt the battery, the nut will fall out, which if you're on the side of the road trying to fix something or adjust something, a lot of times you'll lose that nut, you can't find it. So this is a nice trick that'll keep that from happening. I get a piece of heat shrink tubing, and I just cut it, and I put the nut on top of it, and I put the heat shrink tubing in there. Now you can see when I go to put my screw in, boom, it picks it up right away, and I can hold the weight of the battery. You know, have to get the battery out for some reason, and you're on the highway, and you don't want to lose that screw. Heat shrink tubing. Next thing I do is check the fuel in the gas tank, see if it's got fuel in it, if it's rusty inside. I always want to check my fuel flowing through my line. There you go. I have the carburetor clean and ready to install, but this is the insulator block that goes between the manifold and the carburetor, and there's an O-ring here. The O-ring is cracked and dry rotted in a few areas, and you're gonna get an air leak in there, so I'm gonna go ahead and change that O-ring. Then the O-ring goes in facing the manifold. I took the carburetor apart and cleaned it out. You know, it was a good running motorcycle. It's just been sitting for a long time, so I cleaned out the float bowl. I also put a new O-ring on the gasket surface of the carburetor flange. It's gonna be really cool to hear this bike run after so many years. I haven't ridden it since probably 2007 maybe, so like 17 years. Probably the last time I saw or rode this thing. That's gonna be pretty gratifying. Once I get the fuel system tackled, I always want to check my ignition. You know, I want to check my timer and make sure my points are sparking. All right, next I'm gonna check the engine oil and transmission gear oil. You can bet after all these years that oil tank is empty and all that oil has sumped itself down into the bottom end of the engine. There's nothing in there. Because Harley Davidsons are air and oil cooled, they have a dry sump oiling system, which means the oil is stored in the tank, not in the engine. So your oil, through gravity, will go through the feed line. It'll go past the check ball valve in the oil pump and build up in the bottom of the end of the engine. So this is probably gonna be hard to start when I first go to start it. It's probably gonna kick a lot of oil out of the crankcase vent. It has to get the oil out of the bottom end to be able to run. So it's either gonna pump it out onto the ground through the crankcase vent, and some of it will go back to the oil tank. So I'll usually put a quart of oil in this thing at first, just to have some oil in it and see how much oil returns to the tank and how much goes out into my drip pan. actually got gear oil in there. You can see it down there. That's the clutch throwout bearing that you can see inside the filler hole. And there's oil up on the bottom of that bearing. So I got plenty of oil. That's hard to believe. I'll go ahead and put the license plate on it, just so I know how it is once I get it done. As soon as I get it done, I want to go ride it. So I'll get the plate on it now, so I don't jump on it without a plate, which I've done a million times. This is almost like seeing an old friend that you haven't seen for almost 20 years, you know, like a friend from high school or something like that. Like, oh man, I want to go hang out with you. I want to spend time with you. You know, it's kind of how it feels. Really, the last thing I need to do before I go to start is I'm just going to check my tire pressure. Got about 5 pounds of air in the back tire. I usually run about 15 pounds in a 16-inch tire on a rigid. I think I've got it ready to start. I put fresh fuel in, cleaned the carburetor out and reinstalled the carburetor. I put engine oil in it. I checked the gear oil. I checked the tire pressure. I checked spark. If you have fuel, you have spark, and you have compression, and the timing's set right, it should run. So this is the first time in almost 20 years that I've kick-started this Knucklehead. Pretty excited to do it. Let's give it a shot. Shot of coffee first. You can see this is a cold engine. It really hasn't been running all this time. I don't expect it to start in the first kick, but probably a few. So let's see what happens. It wants to run. That's good news. It's going to be hard to kick because of all the oil in the bottom end. So I built King of Sleaze for a buddy of mine, 2006, 2007, 1941 short rib Knucklehead engine, Harley Davidson engine. Genuine Harley Davidson short rib, 1941 Harley Davidson Knucklehead. And a 1947 Harley Davidson Knucklehead bull neck frame, original frame. This was actually a pretty original bike when I started with it. Back then, 2006, 2007, I think I probably paid like $7 grand, $7,500 for the complete running Knucklehead. You know, original tanks, original fenders, and back then nobody really cared that much about them like they do now, so you sold off all the original parts, traded them off, and took what you wanted. Handmade Indian style leaf spring fork that I made for this, that I got the idea from Flinch from Iron Horse magazine, had done a panhead chopper with an Indian leaf on it, and you know, got to the point to where you couldn't find it at the swap meets anymore, so I started making my own. This bike really steals its style from 3 motorcycles. The first is my Hell's Bell bike that I bought at the 100th anniversary of Harley Davidson in 2003. That was a 1948 Panhead. The second is a 1945 Knucklehead I built in 2005 called Bobzilla. And the third motorcycle, the King of Sleaze, steals some ideas from Indian Larry's Grease Monkey. When I'm finished with a custom motorcycle, I always ride them a lot, a couple thousand miles. I want to make sure before I hand it over to whoever's going to receive it that it's perfect, that everything's done on it, that it's really seasoned. And so things get scratched, things get broken, things fail. And I always keep a part off of every custom motorcycle I've ever built. I took this to Daytona Bike Week in 2007 and the ignition coil burned out on it. So I've had the ignition coil sitting on a shelf in my shop all these years because I had Joe paint it. It was so beautiful. And I had to take it off and just put a plain black ignition coil on it. But this is my souvenir from the King of Sleaze.